Tell it like it is. Don't be ashamed. Let your conscience be your guide. But I know deep down inside of me.
Saludos. It's your host, Gabe Morales, coming back again for another informative episode. So I'm going to be straight up with you guys about some prison cops and investigators here. I often get comments from viewers asking, hey, why don't you talk about gangs that involve cops? And when I say that, I include police as well as prison and jail cops. I actually have a few episodes coming up here in the next year on that topic, and some guests that are going to have some very disturbing and revealing details. However, these individuals have to worry about retaliation, and also they have to worry about potential lawsuits. So they need to clear those episodes with their lawyers first. And that's very understandable. If you are a police officer, then maybe you understand what I'm talking about there. Now, it's been my own experience that anywhere between 1% to 5% cops are corrupt in any agency. It may be more in some agencies and less in some other agencies. Now, a lot of people forget there's the other side of the equation. About 1 to 5% cops, I would say, are very lazy and incompetent. So what does that leave? The other 90 to 98%. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, wow, that's way too high. That's my experience. It's a very small percentage that makes the headline. But it is true what they say, one bad apple can spoil a whole bunch. The vast majority, though, in my experience, do their job satisfactorily. And there's also that small percentage that even go above and beyond the call of duty, true heroes. And I'm proud to call many of those individuals my friends. I've had some of them on the show here. But what about gangs? In my personal experience, really only about 10% of gang members are hardcore, or what you could say are really bad guys. The other 90% can turn their lives around. In fact, I've had some of those individuals on the show also. And I've dealt with a lot of people who are shy about going on camera or fear retaliation, just like a lot of cops do, or fear possibly bringing up something that may incriminate them in past crime. There's no statute of limitation on murder, but even some of them don't feel comfortable talking about some stuff because, quite frankly, a lot of these guys have kids now and they're worried about what their children might think of them. And that's also understandable. I think you would agree. But if you're one of those on the edge that's not sure what to do, maybe have seen some wrongdoing, not sure who to talk to, you could talk to me. And if you're a gang member who's maybe thinking about getting out of the gang lifestyle, you could talk to me. Or maybe if you don't feel comfortable talking to me, I know a lot of intervention workers that can work with you to help you make a decision to possibly change the rest of your life. I know a lot of you have also told me, hey, Morales, I've tried to get into programs, but the waiting lines are very long. Well, I got news for you, my brothers. Church is free and there's no line there. And if you're maybe worried about going to church or don't feel comfortable about being in church, which I've heard some people say, I know some pastors can reach out to you also and teach you the good word. Can I get an amen? Some of you already know a little bit about my background because I've told you, or maybe you've caught a few snippets of that on the show here or there. Let me give you a real brief story of the last 40 years of my life over the last 60 years. When I was in the Marine Corps in the early 1980s, I was stationed in Southern California. I would go out and venture into different barrios. A lot of times I did this accompanying Marines that were from different barrios in Southern California, and they escaped their neighborhoods by joining the military. It was on one of these ventures when I was visiting one of my cousins from Chino, California, where I met my future wife. We ended up hooking up, and she took me all over Southern California. In fact, she lived in Corona and was working in Santa Ana. So we visited there and every place in between and outside of those places. I would go to see her every weekend. Then we got married, stationed at Camp Pendleton, and we lived right outside the gates of the Marine Corps base. And so we visited San Diego, Los Angeles, the Inland Empire, and every point in between. And I paid attention when I was in these barrios because even growing up in my hood in the projects, I was taught to always be aware of your surroundings, head on a swivel. Some of that is described in my autobiography, The Life and Times of Vato Loco, which you can find online, available via Amazon.com and other major platforms. When I met my wife, my mother-in-law was actually working at Chino, and she worked all kinds of places within that facility. That is the receiving center for most of the inmates in Southern California. She worked the famous Palm Hall, where Cheyenne Cadena was killed. Palm Hall had many high-profile inmates. It was at the California Institution for Men at Chino, where she worked with a well-known individual who was the institutional gang investigator and worked as a lieutenant there. And when he retired, we both attended his retirement party. Just so happens I was working at a class for the California Correctional Workers Association, giving a class on prison gangs earlier that day in a hotel in Ontario where he had his retirement party. Now, I visited this guy long before that occasion when he was with the Special Services Unit in Rancho Cucamonga. And I showed him a picture of Jimmy Joe Lucero, aka Noodles, who I knew from Washington State as the Washington State godfather of the Mexican Mafia. Yes, he was a card-carrying carnal. In fact, in this picture, he's standing right next to Robot Salas and other notables like Joe Morgan. It was Robot Salas who kicked off the shoe war against the Nuestra Familia in 1968. And I'll get into that briefly in a minute, but I'll probably have a special episode just on that. I was given this picture by one of my biggest mentors, Robert Moco Morel, who was the founder of the California Prison Gang Task Force when he was with Monterey Park Police Department as a gang detective. It was called the Monterey Park Gang Task Force. And then when his friend Joe Moody took over from the Department of Justice, it was renamed the California Prison Gang Task Force. When I pointed into this picture to Jimmy Joe Lucero, he told me, nope, that's not him. I insisted that, yes, I believed it was, but I did not bring up who my source was. I just said that I had very credible information to the contrary. He still frowned and questioned my assertion, so he asked if I knew what his CDC number was. And in fact, I had that handy. So I gave it to him. He looked it up in his computer and said, wow, this guy really is somebody. I tried not to laugh out of respect. It just so happened that some of Jimmy Joe's supporters tried to kill me at my 21st birthday party in Seattle, Washington. He also questioned whether there ever was any Mexican Mafia in Washington State. Well, we had a place called McNeil Island, and guess what? A lot of people housed there were prison gang members, including Mexican Mafia. Some of you already may know who I'm talking about. The reason why I leave the name of this SSU agent out here is not to embarrass him or try to make him look bad, like he later did to me, but maybe to teach you a lesson, to try to always stay humble and never think that you know it all. I know I have to check my ego sometimes at the door in that regard. I also am not too proud to admit when I'm wrong. And some of you who know me know that I've done that several times. It is also very unfortunate, but a lot of these gang investigators do in fact act like gang members. And a lot of these gang investigator associations act like gangs. That is very sad, but I've heard some of your stories out there, and I know some of you agree with me. I'll give you another example. I once spoke on the phone with the head of the California Gang Task Force at that time. This was many years after Moco left. When I told him that I learned a lot from Moco about prison gangs, he told me that he knew all about him and that he was a Mexican Mafia sleeper. My jaw dropped. I thought, wow, I don't think he even knew Moco personally, or he wouldn't say anything like that. But Chile or somebody who was on the gang task force must have got to him. And some of these guys badmouthed Moco all the way to his death. When Moco was forced out of California because he was blacklisted in a war at the Monterey Park Police Department, he went to Texas where he worked as a gang investigator and was one of the major gang investigators there in Texas by the guy who basically started the Texas validation system, who knew Moco very well. I don't think they would allow Moco to be in the Texas Gang Investigators Association if he was a Mexican Mafia sleeper. It was there that he helped take down many of the Texas Mexican Mafia and interviewed many of them. And he is still well respected in Texas to this very day. I mentioned to another major California Gang Task Force board member that I had personally met, Babo Sosa, former Nuestro General of the Nuestra Familia, and he scoffed at me and told me that I never did. I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure it was him. And then I had also mentioned to him that one of the original Mexican Mafia members, Luis Araujo from Maravilla, East LA, had helped write the Nuestra Familia Constitution. And his reaction was, who the hell is Luis Araujo? Again, I had to shake my head. You got to be kidding me, because I sought hard documentation from Moco and other former California Gang Task Force members. And I later sat down with Chispas Sandoval, who was probably Joe Morgan's number 2, and he verified this, as well as a major gang intervention worker who I will not mention because he's still alive and I don't want to put him at risk, but he verified that, as well as gave me many details on the shoe war because he dealt with all those guys personally and was part of the peace talks way back then. So what I'm basically saying is I try not to involve myself in politics, and that's why I pretty much do my own thing today. Some people say I don't work with other people. I find that hard to believe because people know me well, know I've shared intelligence for years, and I do a lot of research. I just don't take one person's word, whether it be Mocha Morel or anybody else, that something occurred. I usually try to get three independent pieces of information to validate what I believe. And even then, sometimes reevaluating what I think I know. Frank Paco Marcel, who grew up in Pacas Calipas in the San Fernando Valley, once told me he was amazed at what I knew and said, Gabe, you know what? You are a real researcher. I asked Paco to be one of our first International Latino Gang Investigators Association advisors, and he became a big brother to me, like Moco. In fact, it was Paco who introduced me to Moco. If you're watching Paco, do you remember that? I like to call myself a practitioner because I do a lot of academic research. As a researcher, I've also put into practice some of the theories and put to use some of the information that I've gathered in real life. And yes, I've interviewed quite a few prison gang members over the course of my career. And I've interviewed thousands of street gang members and done official gang assessments on them, as well as entered gang validations in Washington State. Last count, I think when I left was around 10,000 gang members. And each one of these were validated with at least three independent pieces of information. I did this when I worked in classification. I hear a lot of people say, wow, you've never been a gang investigator. Again, I don't know what these guys are talking about. They obviously don't know what classification is. If you're a classification in any major jail, you know they're basically like the security threat group intelligence investigators. Although security threat group validations may not be the only thing they do, and it wasn't the only thing that I did.
Chow time, let's go.
Central Tower. Charlie 14, go.
You got sound with this, Peter, or just video?
Got one flatbed truck clear to leave the yard.
Go, chow time.
I also worked in central control for a year on graveyard shift. And guess what? At night, I pull 5-6 files and read the C files, which is the confidential section of the offender's file. So I learned a lot there. I would read these files in between taking facility counts, which was my main job there at night, but it was a little slow. And other than occasional radio traffic and counts, it was kind of boring. But I found these files to be very interesting, and I took note. Now, every year I bid for a new assignment. So I worked there 6 years. I had 6 main assignments. But everywhere I went, I had a little notebook in my upper breast pocket, and I would write down the names and numbers of individuals, as well as note some of their actions and who they kicked it with. But I kept scoring even before that. Like I said, from my 21st birthday party when the Mexican Mafia tried to kill me. And yes, a couple of them were Mexican Mafia members. One of them, Richie Serrato, is mentioned in Mundo Mendoza's video as being a cross-dresser in order to get out of San Quentin's Adjustment Center. But let me tell you something. This guy was active in Seattle. He was straight gangster. So I don't know if he was bipolar or what. Like I said, I worked at the King County for almost a quarter century, from 1993 to 2016. I did take a short break during that time period and worked down in the Los Angeles area and took a job as a gang specialist. It was there that I interviewed juveniles leaving Los Padrinos and headed to the California Youth Authority, or coming out of the California Youth Authority in Los Padrinos and getting ready to go back to the streets on probation. So I learned a lot there. So that's just a little bit of background information for you in case you didn't already know. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please keep those positive comments coming. Thanks for watching, and God bless. This is Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, cops, politicians.
But I know deep down inside of me